it.
And
And
yes, sir, I can. I'm sorry, I was having
that's
trouble with
okay.
my mute. Uh, we are not sharing yet.
Okay, you can't see me?
I can see you.
Okay.
Yes, sir,
Um,
I can see you,
okay, I'm
just
about
not
to
the
share
screen
the
share yet.
screen with you. Okay.
Cool. Thank you.
So here we go. Now you should be able to see that. What is this effect called when this happens? Anybody, does that have a term that people who were involved with computers or video or something that, anyway, that
I've
visual
always called it
echo effect. What?
I always called it multiple mirror effect, but that's not what it is.
Yeah, I mean, that's as good as what I just called it, I guess. Anyway, now you should see a slide that says up at the top, civil rights cases of 1883, correct?
Yes, sir. Thank
Okay.
you.
All right, so let's, does anybody have any questions from last time? Okay, on the material that we covered last time? I'm going to resist the temptation, as I do sometimes, to go back and review the points that we covered last time. Just give you a second here to reflect back on Tuesday's class meeting and um, anything need clarification? Okay, so where we left off last time is we were talking about the first, what I call the first Congressional Civil Rights Agenda. Remember, we had gone through the various acts that Congress passed in the Reconstruction period, the 10-year period following the Civil War. Yes, sir.
Uh, excuse me. I kind of actually forgot my stuff today. I was wondering if I could just take notes on my phone for today.
Yeah, that's fine.
Thank you.
How do you take notes? You must be really proficient with your. You guys are people your age can do that much. I can't do that very well. All right. So anyway, we were running through these. Acts that Congress had passed during the Reconstruction period, and I think the general point that I was trying to make to you was that, certainly I think Americans today might be surprised if they didn't have any previous um, introduction to this period of our history, relatively brief period of our history, how progressive this civil rights agenda was. But it came to an end pretty abruptly. And one of the reasons I suggested to you last time for that abrupt ending, to be quite frank about it, was just that, as Reconstruction comes to an end, and actually this is part of what signals the end of Reconstruction, is you have the former Confederates in the South who are re-enfranchised. Remember, they had been disenfranchised during the Reconstruction period. They now regain not only their right to vote, but their right to hold public office. And the whole power structure in the South, particularly, returns to what had existed before the Civil War. The white power elite came back, and they weren't supportive of this civil rights agenda. So we have lots, for example, we have lots of white Democrats who are elected to the United States Congress in that first Congress after the conclusion of the Reconstruction period, right? Remember, we had looked at these numbers last time, whereas you had these huge Republican majorities that passed these civil rights acts during the Reconstruction period. In this first Congress, the 44th Congress, after the end of Reconstruction, you have, we're back to that old phenomenon that we talked about a couple of weeks ago, which has really been pretty characteristic of the American system historically, divided government. But more particularly, it is the fact that Democrats, Southern Democrats, have returned to Congress in a big way. So as the bottom line is that the political will to continue with any sort of civil rights agenda just evaporates. The political will is just not there anymore. In fact, there are compromises that are made between Southern Democrats and Northern Republicans to sort of back off. But I'll leave that to your history course. When you take your American history course, and I guess it's the second American history course, is it not? The first one goes up through the Civil War, and then the second one begins with Reconstruction, I think. I think that's how they divide it up. But, they probably get into a lot more detail about that kind of stuff. Okay? Now, what we didn't get to last time was that I think the other major factor that brings an end to this civil rights agenda is the Supreme Court. It's sort of the death knell, right? The nail in the coffin, so to speak. And in particular, a couple of cases at the end of the 19th century, the civil rights cases of 1883 and Plessy versus Ferguson. So we're going to take a look at both of these cases in just a little bit of detail because I think it illustrates, they illustrate what happened in this period of our history that led to such a long lull in any sort of civil rights, any movement on civil rights legislation. Remember I told you last time that the Civil Rights Act of, where is it? Well, these things seem to have gotten out of order. Remember I told you last time that the Civil Rights Act of 1875 was the last Civil Rights Act passed by Congress for 80 years. Well, part of it is that the politics, as I explained to you, and part of it is the legacy of the Supreme Court's decision in these cases. Okay? So just to refresh your memory, because the civil rights cases of 1883 are addressing the Civil Rights Act of 1875. Okay, so let's refresh our memory on what was involved in the Civil Rights Act of 1875. This law passed by Congress entitled all persons to the full and equal enjoyment of public accommodations. And again, that's a term that we use to suggest enterprises, businesses that are run by private individuals, but they're open to the public. Okay, so things like hotels, transportation, theaters, places of amusement, etc. Okay, Congress says in this legislation that the people who own and operate these businesses cannot deny service on the basis of race. Okay? If they do, they're subject to the penalties of federal law, of this law, right? So that law, that effort on the part of Congress to criminalize discrimination on the basis of race comes before the Supreme Court. The question comes before the Supreme Court in 1883. Does Congress have the authority under the Constitution to punish private individuals who own and operate businesses for discriminating on the basis of race? Now, obviously, when Congress passed the law in 1875, the majority of its members must have believed that they had the authority under the Constitution to pass that law. Does anybody remember on what basis the majority of Congress might have believed that it had? And by the way, remember, it was a substantial majority, right? Remember those large Republican majorities, okay? What is it in the Constitution that might have led the supermajority of the members of Congress in 1875 to believe that Congress actually had the power under the Constitution to pass a law that punishes private individuals who operate businesses or enterprises that are open to the public for discriminating on the basis of race?
Supremacy clause.
Say it again?
Supremacy.
That's a good guess, but that's actually not the part of the Constitution that we are interested in here. Okay? We talked about a very specific provision of the Constitution in the last class meeting. Okay? The Supremacy Clause is a very, very important provision of the Constitution, but it's not the one really that's at issue here. Jacob, do you remember? Anybody? Well, let's go back and revisit that provision of the Constitution, because it is the critical provision of the Constitution, as I tried to impress upon you last time, if I can find the right spot. sorry. I'm talking about the 14th Amendment. Remember, we said that these three amendments were added to the Constitution after the Civil War, 13th, 14th, 15th Amendment. They're frequently referred to as the Civil War Amendments because they were passed in the years immediately following the Civil War. And while the 13th Amendment and the 15th Amendment are very, very important, don't mean to minimize them at all. The one that we're interested in here is the 14th Amendment. And remember, we said that the 14th Amendment has 5 sections, okay? But the sections that are most relevant for our discussion are Section 1. Who remembers what part of Section 1 in particular? Because there are several pieces of Section 1, right? There's this business in here about a person who's born or naturalized in the United States as a citizen of the United States. There's that privileges and immunities clause. There's that due process clause, right? And there's the equal protection clause. Which one is it? It's the equal protection clause, right? Nor shall any state deprive any person within its jurisdiction the equal protection of the laws. And it's pretty clear that the intent of the framers of this provision of the Constitution were concerned about discrimination on the basis of race and, against the former slaves, right? And then we also said that Section 5 is very relevant for us, right? Why is this part of it so relevant? Remember what we've said now. We reminded you of this in the last class meeting. We talked about it previously. I'm going to remind you of this point one more time, okay? The theory of our system of government is that Congress has only the power that's delegated to it by the Constitution. So the framers of the 14th Amendment understood that. After all, they are almost a century now after the Constitution was written, and the theory that the national government, and that includes Congress, only has the power that's delegated to it by the Constitution was well established over that first century of our history. So they understand that by just writing the words equal protection of the laws in the Constitution, that's not going to somehow magically make equality happen. That Congress is going to have to take action and pass legislation to facilitate civil rights and racial equality. But in order for Congress to be able to do that, there has to be authority in the Constitution for Congress to do that. Okay, so I go back to my original question now. Okay, the majority of the members of Congress in 1875, when they passed this law, must have believed that they had the power under the Constitution to pass this law. What in the Constitution did they believe empowered them to pass this law? Well, how about Section 5 of the 14th Amendment? I think it's probably safe to say that a majority of the members of Congress believed that this provision right here gave Congress, delegated to Congress, the power to pass this law. Right? Okay, so this case comes before the Supreme Court in 1883, and it's actually one of several cases, 5 cases to be exact. So that's why they're all lumped together and called the civil rights cases, but they all have, sort of similar facts and the same basic question. And that question is, does Congress really have the power under the Constitution to pass this law, that punishes private individuals, people who own and operate business? Remember what I told you last time? In the United States, as a general rule, governments, neither the national government nor state governments, operate enterprises like this. There are some examples of government enterprises, but as a general rule, governments don't operate hotels. They don't operate theaters, places of amusement, to some degree transportation systems, but there's certainly lots more private ownership of transportation systems, right? Particularly if we're talking about things like railroads, okay? So what Congress is saying in this legislation is that, these individuals, private individuals who own and operate these businesses can't do that. Now, the court determines that, in fact, Congress does not have the power under the Constitution to do that. Okay? The 14th Amendment delegates to Congress the authority to enact laws that discriminate, discriminatory laws enacted by states. Okay? It says nothing, according to the Supreme Court's decision, the 14th Amendment says nothing about private individuals. So let's go back one more time. Let's go back and look at the 14th Amendment, the language of, sorry about flipping around so much here, but let's go back and look at the language of the 14th Amendment. Okay? Do you see any language in there that says anything about private individuals who own or operate businesses? Who is this, or what is this provision of the 14th Amendment directed at? When we talk about prohibition against discrimination on the basis of race, who or what is this? Okay, so let's hone in here on the Equal Protection Clause. Okay, who is prohibited from denying any person within its jurisdiction equality? Well, not just any state, right? But you're right, the states. This amendment is directed at the power of the states, the Supreme Court says. It has nothing, not a syllable in there, the Supreme Court says, about the ability of individuals to discriminate, right? So what, according to the Supreme Court, what Congress is empowered to do under Section 5 is pass federal laws that prohibit the states from discriminating on the basis of race. It does not empower Congress to pass laws that prevent private individuals from discriminating on the basis of race. Does that make sense? Okay? So, in other words, the Supreme Court is saying that it's not the 14th Amendment. The 14th Amendment is not the governing provision of the Constitution in this case. It is, in fact, the 10th Amendment of the Constitution. Right? Now, who remembers what the 10th Amendment says? We've dealt with the 10th Amendment previously. Okay? Anybody remember what the 10th Amendment says? Remember, the 10th Amendment was part of that package, so to speak, of the first 10 amendments that were added to the Constitution in 1791, called the Bill of Rights. Okay? And the Bill of Rights were generally understood, and the historical intent was to limit the power of the national government, and particularly from the view of the anti-federalists at the time, to protect and preserve the reserved powers of the states. Right? So the 10th Amendment says the power is not delegated to the United States. The power is not delegated to the national government, are reserved to the states respectively. Okay, so let's follow this through again. If the logic here is obvious to you, I apologize, but I really think this is important, because if you don't understand the points that I'm making right here about the civil rights cases of 1883 and the Supreme Court's logic in these cases, when we get to the second civil rights agenda in the middle part of the 20th century, here in just a matter of a couple of minutes, it's not going to make any sense to you. Okay? So let's follow the logic of this through very carefully. Okay? The Supreme Court in 1883 in the civil rights cases says that the 14th Amendment does not delegate to Congress the power to punish private individuals for discriminating on the basis of race. Therefore, under the 10th Amendment, the power to punish individuals for discriminating on the basis of race must be a power that is reserved to the states. Right? In other words, the Supreme Court is saying if we're going to have laws in this country that punish people, individuals, for discriminating on the basis of race, they're going to have to be passed by the Texas state legislature, by the Mississippi state legislature, by the Alabama state legislature, by the Florida state legislature. All the state legislatures around the country are going to have to be the ones that pass those laws. Now, what do you believe the politics was in Texas and Mississippi and Alabama and Florida and Arkansas and Tennessee and all of these other places, right? Politically, was it feasible that these states were going to pass those kind of laws? No, it wasn't. There was no political will in the South. The old white power structure had returned, right? And so there's no political will in the South to pass any of these kinds of civil rights laws. Okay, so what provision of the Constitution is relevant according to the Supreme Court in this case? It's not the 14th Amendment, it is the 10th Amendment. Okay, in fact, you can see right here, here's a passage from the majority opinion that was delivered by Justice Bradley, where he points to the 10th Amendment, right? He says, the truth is that the implication of a power to legislate in this manner is based upon the assumption that if the states are forbidden to legislate or act in a particular way on a particular subject, and powers conferred on Congress to enforce the prohibition, that this gives Congress the power to legislate generally upon that subject. The assumption is certainly unsound. It is repugnant to the 10th Amendment of the Constitution, which declares that the powers not delegated to the national government by the Constitution are reserved to the states. The wrongful act of an individual, unsupported by any state authority, is simply a private wrong. But if not sanctioned in some way by the state or not done under state authority, his rights remain in full force and may presumably be vindicated by resort to the laws of the state for redress. Hence, in all those cases where the Constitution seeks to protect the rights of citizens, the rights of the citizen against discriminative and unjust laws of the state, by prohibiting such laws, it is not individual offenses, acts by private citizens, but abrogation and denial of rights which it denounces and for which it clothes the Congress with a power to provide a remedy. Now that's long and verbose, unwieldy language, but again, all he's saying is that this is a power that's reserved to the states, and so if we're going to have these kind of laws, they're going to have to be passed at the state level. Okay, so any questions about that logic? Yes, sir.
What case is this referring to specifically?
These are the civil rights cases of 1883. There are five cases in total, right? And they're taking them all as a group. Okay. There's another interesting passage here from Justice Bradley's majority opinion that I want to share with you. It's not so much a constitutional issue as it is kind of a social commentary thing. So I think it's kind of interesting. I just kind of want to share this with you. Maybe you'll have some response to it. We'll see, okay? Because I think in this passage, Justice Bradley, speaking for the majority of the court, is really reflecting a view that was quite commonplace in this period of our history, okay? I think today we would look at this very differently, okay? But again, it was quite commonplace, not only among whites, but among many African-American leaders. For example, I told you about Booker T. Washington in the last class meeting, right? So look at this passage here. Bradley writes, when a man has emerged from slavery, and by the aid of beneficent legislation, what does that mean, beneficent legislation? Laws that are passed to benefit him, right? Okay, so when a man has emerged from slavery, and by the aid of beneficent legislation, taking off the inseparable concomitants of that state, there must be some stage in the progress of his elevation when he takes the rank of a mere citizen and ceases to be the special favorite of the laws, and when his rights as a citizen or a man are to be protected in the ordinary modes by which other men's rights are protected. There were thousands of freed colored people in this country before the abolition of slavery, all enjoying all of the essential rights of life, liberty, and property the same as white citizens. Yet no one at that time thought that it was any invasion of his personal status as a free man because he was not admitted to all of the privileges enjoyed by white citizens, and because he was subjected to discriminations in the enjoyment of accommodations and inns, public conveyances, and places of amusement. Mere discriminations on account of race or color were not regarded as badges of slavery. In other words, he's saying that there is a difference between political or legal equality on the one hand and social and economic equality on the other hand. And he's trying to make the case that what the Constitution requires is political legal equality. It does not require social or economic equality. And that's a debate that really has not gone away in this country. And I think that phraseology where he talks about beneficent legislation and ceases to be the favorite of the laws is still with us today, right? For example, in the debate over affirmative action, many people who are opposed to affirmative action will argue reverse discrimination, that affirmative action policies really favor a certain group of people on the basis of some category like race or gender, right, to the disadvantage of people who are not part of that racial group or ethnic group or gender group. You all have heard these arguments before. I'm not introducing to you anything that's new to you, right? And the people who are opposed to those kinds of programs that are designed to benefit, groups that we might consider to be protected categories with, things like affirmative action and so on, typically view those as being, making this group of people the special favorite of the laws. So, the roots of this, even the debates that we have today over some of our most, intractable issues go back at least this far. Well, okay. Any questions about the civil rights cases of 1883? Again, as I said, you really have to be pretty comfortable with the issues that are raised in the civil rights cases, because this is not resolved. The civil rights cases of 1883 do not resolve this question for all time. We're about to revisit it in just a few minutes. Okay, it's going to come back up again, just like, as you know, Brown versus the Board of Education revisited the issue that was raised in Plessy versus Ferguson. Plessy versus Ferguson didn't settle that issue for all time, right? But we kind of have to really understand what the court said in Plessy versus Ferguson before we can have a full appreciation of what the court said in Brown versus the Board of Education. Well, let's talk about Plessy versus Ferguson. This case involved a law of the state of Louisiana that required railroad companies carrying passengers within the state to provide, quote, equal but separate accommodations for white and black persons, empowered train officials to enforce the law, and provided penalties for those who refused to obey segregation orders. Homer Plessy, a black passenger who had been punished with a jail sentence and fined for disobeying the act. Homer Plessy boards a railroad car that is specified reserved for white passengers, sits on a bench in the railroad car. He's promptly taken into custody by train officials, turned over to local authorities. He is charged with violating this Louisiana law. He's put on trial. He's convicted. He's given a prison sentence and a fine. And he appeals that conviction on the grounds that the Louisiana law violates both the 13th Amendment of the Constitution and the Equal Protection Clause of the 14th Amendment. Okay, so I actually have two claims in Plessy versus Ferguson. Okay, now the Supreme Court, in dealing with these claims, dismisses the claim under the 13th Amendment pretty quickly without really giving it much credence. Okay, in fact, here you can see is a portion of the opinion, that majority opinion that was written by Justice Brown in Plessy versus Ferguson, and he's going to address these two claims. The first claim under what does the 13th Amendment do? The 13th Amendment prohibits slavery. Okay, so in response to that claim, Homer Plessy is arguing that the law of the state of Louisiana, in effect, really reestablishes a condition of slavery. That's the first question that the court's going to take up here. Justice Brown writes that it does not conflict with the 13th Amendment, which abolished slavery and involuntary servitude, except as a punishment for crime, is too clear for argument. Slavery implies involuntary servitude, a state of bondage, the ownership of mankind as a chattel, or at least the control of the labor and services of one man for the benefit of another, and the absence of a legal right to the disposal of his own person, property, and services. a statute which implies merely a legal distinction between the white and colored races, a distinction which is founded in the color of the two races and which must always exist so long as white men are distinguished from the other race by color, has no tendency to destroy the legal equality of the two races or reestablish a state of involuntary servitude. He's being quite dismissive, not even going to really explore it, saying it's obvious, he says, that it doesn't reestablish slavery. The more serious claim for Justice Bradley comes under the 14th Amendment. Okay? So let's look at his response to that. So Homer Plessy is arguing that the law of the state of Louisiana that requires equal but separate railroad cars denies him and other persons on the basis of race equal protection of the laws under the 14th Amendment. Okay? Justice Brown writes, by the 14th Amendment, the states are forbidden from making or enforcing any law which shall deny to any person within their jurisdiction the equal protection of the laws. The object of the amendment was undoubtedly to enforce the absolute equality of the two races before the law. But in the nature of things, it cannot have been intended to abolish distinctions based upon color or to enforce social as distinguished from political equality or a commingling of the two races upon terms unsatisfactory to either. So what just Bradley in the civil rights cases had just sort of made, a passing observation about, Justice Brown is taking up directly here in the context of what the Constitution requires. He says that there's a difference. Again, a difference, according to Justice Bradley and the majority of the court, between political and legal equality on the one hand versus social equality on the other hand. And I think the example that he uses here to make his case is fascinating, okay? Because it is, of course, the exact issue that comes before the Supreme Court in 1954 that the Supreme Court rejects. That the majority, in fact, the unanimous Supreme Court rejects in 1954, right? He's talking about public schools, right? He says, laws permitting and even requiring their separation in places where they are liable to be brought into contact do not necessarily imply the inferiority of either race to the other and have been generally, if not universally, recognized as within their competency of the state legislatures in the exercise of their police power. The most common instance of this is connected with the establishment of separate schools for white and colored children, which have been held to be a valid exercise of the legislative power, even by courts of states where the political rights of the colored race have been longest and most earnestly enforced. He said, here's your proof. Look at the public schools. They're separated on the basis of race. Well, lest we belabor it too much, I hope not, but again, we haven't arrived at a point in our society, certainly in a college classroom, where we can't explore these things fully, then there may not be any hope for us, right? So I'm going to share with you a passage from Justice Brown's opinion where, again, he kind of strays away from the constitutional question and really offers what we can consider less of a legal opinion and more of a psychological observation, okay? So he writes, we consider the underlying fallacy of the plaintiff's argument to consist in the assumption that the enforced separation of the two races stamps the colored race with a badge of inferiority. If it be so, it is not by reason of anything found in the act, but solely because the colored race chooses to put that construction on it. Does that impress you at all? What is he saying here? He's saying, look, if the Louisiana law that requires separate railroad cars on the basis of race creates a class system with one class, where there's sort of a hierarchy, right? It's not by virtue of anything in the law. It's because that's the way African Americans choose to feel about it. That's what he's saying. It's in their heads. And then look at this. He says, the argument necessarily assumes that if, as has been more than once the case and is not unlikely to be so again, the colored race should become the dominant power in the state legislature. Remember, I told you in the previous class meeting that during the Reconstruction period, there was at least one state, South Carolina, where African Americans held a majority of the seats, right? Because of African Americans being enfranchised and Confederates being disenfranchised, right? So he says that could happen again, right? And should it happen again, and they should enact a law in precisely similar terms, it would thereby relegate the white race to an inferior position. We imagine that the white race, at least, would not acquiesce in the assumption. The argument also assumes that social prejudices may be overcome by legislation, and that equal rights cannot be secured to the Negro except by enforcing commingling of the two races. We cannot accept this proposition. If the two races are to meet upon terms of social equality, it must be the result of natural affinities, a mutual appreciation of each other's merits, and a voluntary consent of individuals. Well, that is the logic that the Supreme Court in 1954 rejects wholly. Absolutely rejects wholly. It's nonsense. We're going to get to it here in just a second. But the Supreme Court in 1954 says it's absolute nonsense to believe that we can achieve anything approaching racial equality by just allowing people to voluntarily associate themselves with each other, right? The Supreme Court says as long as we keep the races separate, you're never going to have that. Okay, so any questions about Plessy versus Ferguson? On the constitutional matter, the important thing to remember about Plessy versus Ferguson is that the Supreme Court is saying that this policy of separate but equal, which is in place and being carried out by Louisiana anyway and many other states, there's not a constitutional problem with it. That it doesn't offend or it doesn't violate the 14th Amendment Equal Protection Clause. That in fact, so long as accommodations are roughly equal, they can be separate. And that was the pretense. And I say that word deliberately. That was the pretense that was used for another 80 years to justify inequality. So you're here today talking with someone or listening to someone talk who has some memory of going down to Herman Park in downtown Houston and seeing signs on water fountains that say whites only. I'm old, but I don't feel like I'm that old. It's not that long ago where this legal doctrine of separate but equal continued to establish the parameters for race relations in our society. Well, that begins to change in the middle part of the 20th century. Right? Takes a while, but we get to 1954, and the Supreme Court is once again addressing this whole question about the 14th Amendment and this doctrine of separate but equal. Okay? This case, which was decided by the Supreme Court on May 17th, 1954, involved the public education systems in 4 states in the District of Columbia. So there's actually 5 cases that the Supreme Court's dealing with here. The lead case came out of Topeka, Kansas. So we oftentimes just say Brown versus the Board of Education, but Brown versus the Topeka Board of Education. That case involved a young woman named Lucy Brown, African-American girl whose family lived I'm not sure if literally directly across the street from an elementary school that was specified for whites only, but certainly within walking distance. I don't know, so any of you are interested, you can go check that out. I've heard different versions of that story. One that her family lived directly across the street, but that proximity doesn't really matter. The point is that under the law in Topeka, Kansas, African American school children had to be separated, to go to different schools than their white counterparts. In fact, let me just show you this here real quick. Here's a map indicating at the time of the court's decision in Brown versus the Board of Education what the situation was in this country. There was a group of states, the ones in green, maybe doesn't surprise anyone, southern states, where segregation was required by law. The state laws required that white and black school children be segregated. And then you had another group of states, these ones here in sort of goldenrod color, where it was determined by local option, and that included Kansas, right? So Topeka, Kansas, their local decision was to segregate, okay? Then you had another group of states where it was prohibited by law, okay? These states here, I'm not sure what you would call that color, that rust or something, right? Okay? And then you have a handful of states where there's no legislation governing it at all, nothing codified in the books, okay? So when we say that this case directly involved 5 jurisdictions, 4 states and the District of Columbia, but indirectly the public school systems of many other states, it's because you had all of these other states where segregation was being practiced, at least in the case of these states, at least in some parts of the state. Okay? All right, so we know how this case came out. I don't think I'm surprising anyone here by telling you that the court held that the public education systems in these jurisdictions violated the 14th Amendment Equal Protection Clause. Right? In fact, it was a unanimous decision of the Supreme Court. And the bottom line is that the Supreme Court rules in these cases that segregation on the basis of race, based on the doctrine of separate but equal that was established in Plessy versus Ferguson, is unconstitutional. It violates the 14th Amendment Equal Protection Clause. But as you might suspect, there's some specifics that we need to investigate here, okay? All right. So Chief Justice Earl Warren wrote the opinion of the court. By the way, Earl Warren was a Republican that had been appointed by Dwight Eisenhower. And one of the reasons that he was appointed by Dwight Eisenhower was because he had been the Republican governor of California. I'm talking about Earl Warren, had been the Republican governor of California. He had, his entire life to that point had been active in Republican Party politics, and he was recognized as a conservative. Okay? And so I think when Eisenhower tapped him to be Chief Justice, Eisenhower believed that the decisions of the court under his guidance would be more conservative. But the Warren Court is viewed by most observers who try to be objective anyway, as really being the beginnings of liberal activism on the court. If you read that chapter on the courts in anticipation of the quiz today, you know what I mean by that terminology, liberal activism. It was during the middle part of the 20th century under Earl Warren's leadership that the Supreme Court began handing down lots of cases that can be both described as activist and politically liberal, not only in the area of racial integration, but in the area of criminal due process. Like this is the court that handed down the decision in Mapp versus Ohio and Miranda versus Arizona. Some of you may be familiar with those cases. Okay, pretty liberal, politically pretty liberal court. Okay, and no question that it was an activist court. Okay. All right. So here's what Chief Justice Warren writes in his unanimous opinion. Such considerations apply with added force to children in grade and high schools to separate them from others of similar age and qualifications solely because of their race generates a feeling of inferiority as to their status in the community that may affect their hearts and minds in a way unlikely ever to be undone. We conclude that in the field of public education, the doctrine of separate but equal has no place. Separate educational facilities are inherently unequal. Therefore, we hold that the plaintiffs and others similarly situated for whom the actions have been brought are, by reason of the segregation complained of, deprived of the protection of the equal protection of the laws guaranteed by the 14th Amendment. Okay, so that's the constitutional principle that the court is resting on in this case. But this case has, as I've shared with you with the previous cases, has some other aspects to it. Okay, so let me share that with you. Just like Justice Brown had his psychological commentary, Chief Justice Earl Warren takes a similar tack. Okay? In fact, you know, this opinion of the Supreme Court, this unanimous opinion written by Earl Warren, is interesting for a lot of reasons. One of the reasons, you know, not directly related to the constitutional questions, was that it's just the style with which it's written. Because if you were to look up any decision of the United States Supreme Court, maybe there's one that you're particularly interested in. Maybe you're interested in the Griswold decision, or maybe you're interested in Lawrence and Garner versus Texas, or McCulloch versus Maryland, or any other case that, you know, historically has been handed down by the Supreme Court. You're to do a Google search and then, you know, click on one of the links where you could read the entire opinion, like the entire syllabus of the case and the opinions of the justices. You know, obviously they deal with different issues and different questions, but they tend to have a certain style. There's a lot of citation of case law, statute law, and so on. But this one is a little bit different. One of the reasons it's different is because there's less of that. There's less. You read the opinion, Earl Warren's opinion in Brown versus the Board of Education, there's not as much citation of case law and citation of statute law and so on, but there's a lot of citations from scholarly psychological and sociological journals. It almost reads like a graduate thesis, you know, somebody who's getting their master's degree or their PhD degree in sociology. I think that's an interesting aspect of the case, right? And so here's a passage where you kind of get a flavor of that. He writes, "The effect of this separation on their educational opportunities was well stated by a finding in the Kansas case by a court which nevertheless felt compelled to rule in the case against the Negro plaintiffs. Segregation of white and colored children in public schools has a detrimental effect upon the colored children. The impact is greater when it has the sanction of law. For the policy of separating the races is usually interpreted as denoting the inferiority of the Negro group. A sense of inferiority affects the motivation of a child to learn. Segregation with the sanction of law, therefore, has a tendency to retard the educational and mental development of Negro children and to deprive them of some of the benefits they would receive in a racially integrated school system. Whatever may have been the extent of psychological knowledge at the time of Plessy versus Ferguson," Earl Warren says, and he's responding directly to Justice Brown's psychological commentary about, remember Justice Brown said, it's in their heads. It says not in the law, it's because they choose to believe, they choose to feel that way. He's saying whatever might have been the state of psychological knowledge at that time, okay, this finding is amply supported by modern authority. What does he mean, modern authority? He means the psychiatry community, the psychologist community, the sociologists, and so on. Any language in Plessy versus Ferguson contrary to this finding is rejected. Now, there's another aspect of this case that is important for us to understand. So the court, there's actually two hearings of this case before the Supreme Court. The initial decision comes down on May 17, 1954, and that's the part of the case where the court is laying out the constitutional principle. Saying that, again, what is the bottom line? What is the finding of the court, the holding of the court? That separation on the basis of race, the doctrine of separate but equal, is inconsistent with the 14th Amendment Equal Protection Clause. That, in fact, there really is no other reason to segregate other than to denote a condition of superior or inferior. Why else segregate? The court's saying. But it's a very complicated case because the court recognizes that by simply saying that you can't segregate on the basis of race doesn't mean that somehow magically, automatically, public school systems around the country are going to be racially integrated. They recognize that there's going to be some, at least some logistical impediments to segregation, and there's probably going to be some political resistance too, right? So let's see what the Supreme Court says about that. He says at stake is the personal interest of the plaintiffs, Lucy Brown, for example, and whoever the plaintiffs were in the other cases, right? At stake is the personal interest of the plaintiffs in admission to public schools as soon as practically possible on a non-discriminatory basis. But then there's all of the others who are in Lucy Brown's situation, who are not before the court, who are similarly situated, right? And he says, to effectuate this interest may call for the elimination of a variety of obstacles in making the transition to school systems operated in accordance with the constitutional principles set forth in our May 17, 1954 decision. Courts of equity may properly take into account the public interest in the elimination of such obstacles in a systematic and effective manner. But it should go without saying that the vitality of these constitutional principles cannot be allowed to yield simply because of disagreement with them. While giving weight to these public and private considerations, the courts will require the defendants make a prompt and reasonable start towards full compliance. In other words, let the plaintiffs into school, right? And then work on how to get others similarly situated, right? Once such a start has been made, the courts may find that additional time is necessary to carry out the ruling in an effective manner. The burden rests upon the defendants. Who are the defendants? The states and the school systems, right? The burden rests upon the defendants to establish that such time is necessary in the public interest and is consistent with good faith compliance at the earliest practicable day. In other words, they're saying that we're not going to let you drag your feet. You got to show us that you're making an effort to get to where we need to be, okay? To that end, the courts may consider problems related to administration arising from the physical condition of school plant, school transportation system, personnel, revision of school districts and attendance areas into compact units to achieve a system of determining admission to the public schools on a non-racial basis, and revision of local laws and regulations which may be necessary in solving the foregoing problems. They will also consider the adequacy of any plans the defendants may propose to meet these problems and to effectuate the transition to a racially non-discriminatory school system. During this period of transition, the courts will retain jurisdiction over these cases. The judgments below, except that in the Delaware case, are accordingly reversed, and the cases are remanded to the district courts to take such proceedings and enter such orders and decrees consistent with this opinion as are necessary and proper to admit to public schools on a racially non-discriminatory basis with all deliberate speed. That quote, or that little phrase right there, all deliberate speed, is key, all right, to the parties in these cases. By the way, that phrase, all deliberate speed, is an interesting phrase because in some ways it's contradictory, isn't it? Right? Because if you are speedy, right, you're fast, you're getting things, you're complying. Here's the compliance criterion that we talked about. You're complying as quickly and efficiently as you possibly can. But to be deliberate means to be slow and thoughtful and careful, right? Somebody cautions you to behave more deliberately, act more deliberately. They're telling you don't just go off, half-cocked, willy-nilly. Think about what you're doing, right? And that means slowing down a little bit. Right? So just the phrase itself is kind of an interesting choice of words. So the court is saying, we recognize that it's going to take some time to do this. Okay? But as I shared with you in a previous class meeting last week, remember looking at these numbers, there's some real questions about whether the compliance with the court's order in Brown versus the Board of Education was consistent with the order. Right? Because as we pointed out, 10 years after the court's decision, the overwhelming majority, almost 98% of African American school children in the South attended public elementary or secondary schools where the enrollment was virtually 100% African American. Is that deliberate speed? 10 years after the fact? About a dozen years after the fact, you still have 83%. Or 14 years after the fact, right? You have 75% of African American school children attending public elementary or secondary schools where the enrollment is majority black. And again, you see some slow movement of the numbers down to the mid-1970s. And when we looked at these numbers a week ago, we didn't really have time to explore the question of, well, why did the numbers just end in the mid-1970s? Well, one answer to that question is because the book that I took this from was published in the early 1980s, a book that I had on my shelves, right? Okay, but there's a more important reason, okay? And that is that subsequent to the court's decisions in Brown versus the Board of Education, you had a number of other cases that went before the Supreme Court that made it the progress towards full racial integration problematic. One in particular was a case called Milliken versus Bradley, and I don't have that in here. Oh, wait, no, I'm sorry, I'm jumping ahead of myself. One case here, Swan versus Charlotte Mecklenburg, okay? So, yeah, this is an important case. In 1971, okay, a case comes before the Supreme Court, and essentially what the plaintiffs are arguing is that look at these numbers. They're saying, look at these numbers. Okay? Not only in the Charlotte Mecklenburg School District, but in all these other places around the country where you've had very little movement towards racial integration. And the court agrees that movement towards racial integration has been too slow. And this is the case where the court orders busing to achieve integration. That's not Brown versus the Board of Education. Let's be clear on kind of the historical facts here. In Brown versus the Board of Education, 1954, the Supreme Court didn't order busing. You know what I mean by busing, right? Okay? That didn't come until 1971. And I think that the court's decision here in Swan versus Charlotte Mecklenburg to order busing and, quote, other awkward remedies, that was the phrase that the court used in 1971, awkward remedies, is largely out of frustration with a lack of compliance on the part of these jurisdictions with their court order from 1954. Do you understand what I'm saying? The court, look, I don't want to oversimplify this too much, but just for dramatic purposes, let me suggest this to you. I think this is kind of what the court's saying in Swan versus Charlotte Mecklenburg. It's not that difficult. Okay? Here's what you do. You get a bus and you drive it into a predominantly African-American neighborhood and you pick up African-American school children and you take them to a predominantly white school and you unload them. You get another bus, you drive it into a predominantly white neighborhood, you pick up white kids and you take them to a predominantly black school. Integration. Now, again, I don't mean to oversimplify, but I'm trying to drive the point home that I think this is out of frustration that the court has with a lack of compliance. You see, because what all the school districts around the country, what state leaders and so on were arguing is it's too hard. It's going to cost too much money. We don't have the teachers. We don't have the facilities. There's going to be trouble if we have to go through with and meet this mandate to integrate. And the court, I think, gets fed up with it by 1971 and says, it's clear you're not going to do it, so we're going to tell you how to do it. Now, there's a certain amount of truth in that, because once the court ordered busing to achieve integration, that's when there were riots and there were, problems that came along in the early 1970s in mainly northern cities, places like Boston and Detroit, out in the West Coast in California, Los Angeles, and so on. Some in the South. But it also led, this order for court-ordered busing and, quote, other awkward remedies, also led to another phenomenon. I wonder if you all have heard of this. The phenomenon of white flight. Any of you ever come across that before? It's not completely the result of the court-ordered busing, but court-ordered busing plays an important role, I think. It's the phenomenon that sociologists have described, others have described, demographers and others have described during this period of our history, where whites moved in large numbers from large urban areas out to the suburbs. So, for example, the area that you're in right now, Sugar Land, which, interestingly enough, in 2021 is one of the most diverse places in the country. Are you aware of that? Are you aware that Sugar Land, the East Fort Bend County, Harris County, East Fort Bend County, is one of the most racially and ethnically diverse places in the country? Well, it is, but it hasn't always been that way. In fact, that's been a relatively recent development. There was a time when this area was almost totally white. It was the result of whites moving from Houston out to the suburbs, in part to escape busing orders. Now, why would that allow them to escape busing orders? Well, because of the case that I started to tell you about. I was jumping ahead of myself. Milliken versus Bradley, 1974 case, came out of the state of Michigan. And the question before the court in Milliken versus Bradley was, can busing be forced across school district lines? In many parts of the country, Texas is certainly a place where this is true, you have what are called independent school districts. You know what that means? Anybody know what that means? The Fort Bend Independent School District, or the Houston Independent School District, or the Lamar Consolidated Independent School District. What does that independent school district mean?
Have their own budgets.
They do, and they have their own governing authority. They're separate governments. It's not, for example, in most parts of the country, it's not like it is, say, in New York City. Like in New York City, the public schools are run by the city of New York, right? But in many other parts of the country, and certainly it's true in Texas, it was true in Michigan, they're their own governing entities. And so I'm not going to bother you too much with the details of this case, just get to the bottom line. What they were trying to do in Michigan was, you had in the Detroit area, suburbs, just like you have in the Houston area, you have Sugar Land and the Woodlands and all these kind of areas. In Detroit, you have the city of Detroit, and then you have all these suburban areas, Dearborn, Michigan, for example, right? And whites were moving in large numbers out to Dearborn and other suburban areas. And so what the governor of the state, was trying to do was bus whites from the suburbs into the Detroit area and bus African-American students out from Detroit to the suburbs. And that was challenged, and the Supreme Court said, no, you can't bus across district lines. You can't force busing across district lines. These are independent government jurisdictions. And that is why that table ends at 1976, in part because any movement that we began to see towards racial integration of the public schools as a result of the busing orders came to a pretty sudden halt as a result of white flight and the resulting decision of the Supreme Court in Milliken versus Bradley. And so you have a situation where even down to today, many black civil rights leaders will argue that the court's mandate in Brown versus the Board of Education has never been fully achieved. Now, it's less obvious at the high school level, I think, particularly in small towns. I think I've told you all that I spent a good chunk of my professional career in Temple, Texas, and Central Texas. And they have one high school. It's a large high school. I think it's a 6A high school, okay? But there's only one high school, so that white and black school kids go to the same high school. But where you tend to see it is more at the middle school and the elementary school level. Because as long as we value the concept of neighborhood schools, right? And neighborhoods tend to be de facto segregated. The fact of the matter is that whites tend to live in certain areas, and African Americans tend to live in certain areas, and Latinos tend to live in certain areas. And so if their kids go to the neighborhood schools, to the extent that the neighborhoods are segregated, then the schools are also going to be segregated. All right? So that's why I think, as I say, I think some civil rights leaders argue that we just really have never fully gotten there. Okay, we're out of time. We probably will we're going to need to take a few minutes at the beginning of the class meeting on Tuesday to finish up a few points that I think we shouldn't just forget about. So we'll see you on Tuesday.